Welcome to Tales by Imon. Settle in, and let us begin our story. The scent of old paper and stale coffee was the permanent perfume of Dr. Ethan Hayes's office at Georgetown University. It was a small space, a forgotten corner in the history department, crammed with books that threatened to spill from their shelves and form a literary avalanche. Ethan, a man whose passion for American history was matched only by the world's apparent indifference to it, was in his late 30s but already felt the comfortable, worn-out feeling of a much older academic. His days were a predictable loop of lecturing to half-asleep freshmen about the Federalist Papers and writing grant proposals that were invariably, and politely, rejected. He craved a real mystery, a tangible link to the past he so adored, but his life was a testament to the mundane. That, however, was about to change. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon, a day as gray and unremarkable as any other. It was from a law firm in rural Virginia, a place Ethan hadn't thought about in over a decade. The voice on the other end was somber, professional, and delivered the news with practiced gentleness. His grandfather, Arthur Hayes, had passed away. Ethan felt a strange, hollow echo of grief. He hadn't been close to Arthur. His grandfather was a man who lived on the fringes, a brilliant but troubled soul who had traded a promising engineering career for a life of obsession. Arthur Hayes was a chaser of shadows, a believer in conspiracies, a man who saw codes and weather patterns in secret societies in the local town council. To a young Ethan, he had been a source of bewildering, often frightening, stories. To the adult Ethan, he was a cautionary tale, a brilliant mind lost to paranoia. The lawyer, a Mr. Thompson, explained that Arthur had left Ethan a single item. Not the crumbling house filled with stacks of newspapers and cryptic charts, but a small, locked wooden box. Curiosity, mingled with a sense of familial duty, gnawed at him. The following Saturday, Ethan drove the 2 hours out of D.C., the city's marble monuments giving way to the rolling hills and quiet towns of Virginia. The law office was as antiquated as the town it served. Mr. Thompson, a kind man with watery eyes, handed him the box. It was old, made of a dark, heavy wood, and bound with tarnished brass fittings. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of a shoebox, and it felt surprisingly heavy. There was a simple, old-fashioned key in the lock. "Your grandfather was very specific," Mr. Thompson said, peering over his glasses. "He said you were the only one who would know what to do with it. He said you had the sight for the unseen." Ethan gave a weak smile, remembering his grandfather's strange phrases. It was the kind of thing Arthur would say. He thanked the lawyer, took the box, and left, the weight of it in his hands feeling less like an inheritance and more like a burden. Back in the familiar, dusty sanctuary of his university office, he placed the box on his cluttered desk. For a moment, he just stared at it. What final piece of madness had his grandfather left him? With a sigh, he turned the key. The lock clicked open with a satisfying, metallic sound. He lifted the lid. The inside was lined with faded, dark blue velvet. There were only two things nestled within. The first was a thick, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The second was a single, crisp, $1 bill. Ethan frowned. A single dollar? It was an odd inheritance. He picked it up. It felt different from modern currency. It was a silver certificate, the blue seal and serial numbers indicating it was from a series printed decades ago. It was in remarkably good condition, as if it had been preserved the moment it left the press. He was about to dismiss it, to toss it onto his desk and open the journal, when something caught his eye. He switched on his bright desk lamp, the one he used for examining old manuscripts. He angled the dollar bill under the light. There, on the back of the bill, was the iconic, mysterious image of the Great Seal, the unfinished pyramid topped by the Eye of Providence. He'd lectured on its symbolism 100 times, the 13 steps, the Latin phrases annuit coeptis and novus ordo seclorum. It was familiar territory. But this was different. He grabbed the heavy magnifying glass he kept in his desk drawer. Leaning in, he focused on the pyramid. At first, he saw nothing. But then, as he adjusted the angle of the light, he saw it. Microscopic markings. They weren't printing errors. They were far too precise. Etched into the faint lines of the pyramid stones were tiny, almost invisible characters. They weren't letters or numbers he could immediately recognize. They were symbols, elegant and strange, hidden in plain sight for anyone with the patience, or the madness, to look. His heart began to beat a little faster. This was not random. This was deliberate. This was a secret. With a trembling hand, he set the dollar bill down carefully and reached for the journal. The leather cover was soft and worn. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was his grandfather's, a spidery, frantic script that filled every inch of the page. The first entry was dated nearly 40 years ago. It read, "They think it's money, a symbol of commerce. They are blind. It was never just a bill. It is a map, a key, a promise. The founding fathers, the true architects, they understood the power of symbols. They didn't build a country, they built a lock. And they hid the key where no one would ever think to look, yet where everyone would see it. It is in the eye of the eagle, the leaves of the olive branch, and the stones of the pyramid. But the starting point, the very first step, is the eye. The eye doesn't just watch over. It watches something. It sees a location. And the bill I hold, the one I leave for you, Ethan, is the only one that can show the way. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He looked from the frantic words in the journal to the single-dollar bill lying under the bright lamplight on his desk. The room was silent, but his mind was roaring. The strange, microscopic symbols on the pyramid seemed to pulse with a hidden meaning. His grandfather's lifetime of obsession, which Ethan had always dismissed as the ravings of a troubled mind, suddenly felt terrifyingly real. The mundane world of lectures and rejected grant proposals dissolved away, replaced by the weight of the two objects on his desk. An old man's journal and a single-dollar bill. A key and a map. The first chapter of a mystery that was far older and far more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. His real education was about to begin. The silence of the university office was absolute, broken only by the frantic thumping of Ethan's own heart. The world outside, with its deadlines, lectures, and faculty meetings, had vanished. His reality had shrunk to the surface of his mahogany desk, to the cryptic words of a dead man and the impossible secret held by a single, ordinary dollar bill. 4 hours, he sat frozen, reading and rereading the first page of his grandfather's journal. A map. A key. The eye sees a location. It was the kind of pronouncement he would have scoffed at just that morning, dismissing it as the cornerstone of another elaborate conspiracy theory. But the physical proof was undeniable. The microscopic etchings on the bill were real, and they were waiting to be deciphered. Slowly, his academic instincts began to surface, pushing through the initial shock. He was a historian, a researcher. This was a primary source document of the most extraordinary kind. He had to approach it methodically. He gently placed the dollar bill under a glass paperweight to protect it, and turned his full attention to the journal. He spent the next few hours poring over his grandfather's dense, looping script. The journal wasn't a linear narrative but a chaotic collection of thoughts, historical references, and complex diagrams. Arthur wrote of secret societies hiding within the nascent American government, not as malicious cabals, but as guardians of a profound knowledge they feared the young republic was not ready for. He called them the custodians of the covenant. According to Arthur, these custodians believed that the nation's survival depended on a wisdom that couldn't be entrusted to fleeting politics or fallible leaders. They encoded this knowledge, a location of immense historical and scientific importance, into the very fabric of the nation's currency, designing it as a multi-generational puzzle. It was a failsafe, a legacy for a future time when it would be needed most. The journal was filled with dead ends and wild theories, but among the paranoia were glimmers of his grandfather's brilliance. Arthur had spent decades trying to crack the code. He had cross-referenced the symbols with everything from Masonic ciphers and Rosicrucian texts to alchemical tables and forgotten Native American petroglyphs. Most of his attempts had ended in failure, detailed in pages filled with frustrated, crossed-out equations and angry notes to himself. "They are not a simple substitution," Arthur wrote in one entry. "To think so is an insult to the minds that created this. This is not a code to be broken, it is a language to be understood. The symbols do not replace letters. They convey concepts. Position, angle, and relation to each other are as important as the shapes themselves." Armed with this insight, Ethan turned back to the dollar bill. He spent the rest of the night and most of the next day in a feverish state of research. He photographed the symbols through his magnifying glass, enlarging them on his computer screen. He printed them out, cutting and arranging them, trying to find a pattern. He pulled dusty tomes from his shelves, books on cryptography, sacred geometry, and the history of cartography. Nothing matched. The symbols were unique, a maddening blend of geometric precision and esoteric flourish. Frustration began to set in. He felt like he was falling into the same rabbit hole that had consumed his grandfather. Was this the true inheritance? Not a secret, but the madness of chasing one? He slumped back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. The office was dark now, the only light coming from his desk lamp, which cast long shadows that made the piles of books look like ancient, sleeping beasts. His gaze fell upon the journal again, lying open to a page he had skimmed over earlier. It was a section about the design of Washington, D.C. itself. Arthur had been obsessed with Pierre L'Enfant's original 1791 plan for the capital city. He, like many others, had noted the geometric patterns formed by the city's major avenues and landmarks. the pentagrams, the triangles, the Masonic square and compass. But Arthur's theory went further. L'Enfant did not design a city, the journal claimed. He designed a lock. The streets are the tumblers, the monuments are the pins. It is a massive, geographic cipher laid out on the land itself. The bill is the key, but the city is the mechanism. The key is useless without the lock it was designed to open. Ethan's mind raced. The key is useless without the lock. He had been trying to decipher the symbols in a vacuum, treating them as a self-contained puzzle. But what if they only made sense when projected onto something else? What if they were coordinates? He scrambled to a large filing cabinet in the corner of his office where he kept his collection of historical maps. His fingers trembled slightly as he rifled through the folders. He wasn't looking for a modern map, but one as close to the original design as possible. He found what he was looking for, a high-quality reproduction of the original L'Enfant plan, with its grand avenues and unimplemented designs. He carefully unrolled the large parchment on his office floor, weighting down the corners with heavy books. The familiar layout of the nation's capital looked alien and new, a web of intricate lines and empty spaces. With renewed energy, Ethan went back to his desk. He created a grid overlay on the photograph of the pyramid, numbering each of the tiny symbols he had identified. There were 15 of them in total, scattered across the 13 steps of the stone structure. He took his laptop and the dollar bill and sat on the floor beside the sprawling map. His hypothesis was simple, yet felt monumental. Each symbol on the pyramid corresponded to a specific location or intersection on the L'Enfant plan. The position of the symbol on the pyramid, which step it was on, how far to the left or right, must be the key to finding its corresponding point on the map. He started with a symbol at the very base of the pyramid, the first step. It was a small, sharp, triangular shape. According to his grandfather's notes on the city's geometry, the base of the capital's design was the Potomac River. The first step of the pyramid must correspond to a landmark along the city's southern edge. He measured the symbol's position and began cross-referencing it with the major intersections on the map's grid. After nearly an hour of painstaking calculations, he found a match. The symbol's coordinates pointed directly to a location known in L'Enfant's time as Jenkins Hill, the place chosen for the construction of the U.S. Capitol building. A shiver ran down his spine. It wasn't random. It was a perfect match. His heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and dread, he moved to the second symbol, and then the third. One by one, he translated the symbols from the dollar bill into points on the old map. A point for the White House. A point for the Washington Monument's planned location. Each one was a cornerstone of the Capitol's design. He was tracing a path through history, laid out by the nation's founders. But the final few symbols didn't point to major landmarks. They led him to more obscure locations, an old crossroads, a specific fountain, a forgotten public square. They were forming a pattern, a line that snaked through the heart of the city. He connected the dots with a pencil, his hand shaking. The line terminated at a single, final point. A point located in one of the city's oldest neighborhoods, a place of no apparent national significance. It was a small, unassuming circle on the 18th century map, labeled simply as the Mason's Compass. Today, he knew, it was a small public park, surrounded by historic townhouses. Ethan stared at the final point on the map. The journey was over. The puzzle was solved. But a new, more daunting question hung in the air, heavy and cold. The cipher had given him a location. It had given him a destination. But what in the world was he supposed to find there? The pencil dropped from Ethan's numb fingers and rolled across the old map, coming to a stop on the marked location, the Mason's Compass. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, the adrenaline of discovery slowly giving way to a profound sense of unease. The chase had been exhilarating, a purely intellectual exercise conducted within the safe, dusty walls of his office. But the map on his floor was no longer just a historical document. It was an instruction. It was demanding that he leave the world of theory and books and step into the physical reality of his grandfather's obsession. A wave of doubt washed over him. What if this was all just an elaborate wild goose chase, the final, intricate prank of a brilliant but deluded old man? What could possibly be waiting in a tiny, forgotten city park? But then he looked back at the dollar bill, still secure under its glass paperweight. The symbols were real. The path they formed was mathematically precise. This was no prank. It was a carefully constructed trail, and he was standing at the very beginning. The historian in him, the man who had spent his life searching for a tangible connection to the past, couldn't turn back now. He made his decision. He would go at dawn. The darkness would provide cover, and the first light of morning might reveal something that the harsh glare of noon would hide. He spent the next few hours preparing, a strange mix of academic and amateur field explorer. He left the precious dollar bill locked securely in his office safe, but he carefully folded the annotated copy of the L'Enfant map and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He slid his grandfather's journal into his worn leather satchel, alongside a high-powered flashlight, his phone, and a small digital camera. He felt a nervous energy he hadn't experienced since his doctoral defense, a potent cocktail of anticipation and fear. He drove through the sleeping streets of Washington, D.C. as the sky was just beginning to soften from black to a deep indigo. The city's monuments, usually bustling with tourists, were silent, imposing silhouettes against the approaching dawn. The Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, the Capitol Dome, they seemed different to him now. Not just structures of stone and marble, but silent witnesses, parts of the massive, secret mechanism his grandfather had written about. The park was located in the historic Georgetown neighborhood, a section of the city known for its cobblestone streets and federal-style architecture. It was exactly as he had imagined, small, unassuming, and nestled between rows of multi-million-dollar townhouses. A low, wrought iron fence enclosed a simple grassy area with a few stone benches and a circular brick path. In the center stood a weathered, verdigris-coated bronze statue of a stern-looking man in colonial attire, a local politician from the 18th century, long forgotten by the city's collective memory. There was no plaque identifying the park as the Mason's Compass. The name had been lost to time, surviving only on old maps like the one in his pocket. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of the nearby Potomac River. Ethan slipped through the gate, his footsteps unervingly loud on the gravel path. He felt exposed, a trespasser in the quiet morning. He sat on a cold stone bench and pulled out the journal, his flashlight casting a small, focused beam on the page. He needed the final piece of the puzzle. The map had led him here, but it didn't tell him where to look. He flipped through the frantic script until he found a section dedicated to this very location. Arthur's words were, as always, cryptic. At the compass, the cardinal points are a deception. North, south, east, and west are for ordinary men navigating an ordinary world. The custodians look to a higher plane. Stand at the center, before the founder. He does not watch the people, he watches the heavens. Follow his unblinking gaze as it meets the first light, the morning star. Where his shadow ends, your path begins. Ethan looked up from the journal towards the statue. The founder. He walked to the center of the park and stood before the bronze figure. The statue faced directly east. The first light. The morning star. That would be the planet Venus, often visible in the eastern sky just before sunrise. The sky was now a lighter shade of purple, and a single, brilliantly bright point of light hung above the horizon. The morning star. He positioned himself behind the statue, looking directly over its shoulder, aligning its gaze with the distant planet. The statue's shadow, long and faint in the pre-dawn glow, stretched out across the manicured grass. He followed the line of the shadow with his eyes, tracing it from the statue's base all the way to the edge of the circular brick path. His breath caught. Where his shadow ends, your path begins. The shadow terminated precisely on a single, specific brick paver. Ethan knelt down, his heart hammering against his ribs. The brick looked just like all the others, worn smooth by 2 centuries of footsteps and weather. But as he ran his fingers over its surface, he felt it. A subtle indentation, almost imperceptible. He pressed down. The brick shifted slightly, a low grinding sound breaking the morning silence. Using his fingers, he carefully pried the paver loose from the damp earth. Beneath it was a small, dark cavity. His flashlight beam cut through the blackness, revealing a small object wrapped in oilcloth. His hands trembled as he reached into the hole and lifted it out. He carefully unwrapped the cloth. Lying in his palm was a disc of cool, heavy brass, about the size of a silver dollar. It wasn't money. One side was smooth, but the other was covered in a complex, circular pattern of the exact same symbols he had seen on the dollar bill. They were arranged in concentric rings, like the gears of an intricate watch. In the very center of the disc was a perfectly crafted, small circular hole. It was some kind of lens holder, or perhaps a key of a type he had never seen before. A wave of triumph washed over him. It was real. All of it. He had found the next piece of the puzzle. He carefully rewrapped the brass disc, slipped it into his pocket, and replaced the brick paver, brushing away the dirt to hide any sign of disturbance. As he stood up to leave, a sound pricked the silence. The crunch of gravel. It came from the park's entrance behind him. He froze, every muscle tensed. He slowly turned his head, expecting to see an early morning jogger or someone walking their dog. But there was no one there. The gate was still. The street beyond was empty. He dismissed it as his nerves, a mind overtired and electrified by discovery. He took a deep breath and started walking towards the gate. Then he heard it again. A distinct, deliberate footstep on the pavement just outside the fence, followed by the faint metallic click of what sounded like a car door closing softly down the street. He peered into the shadows between the townhouses, but saw nothing. Yet, the feeling was unmistakable. He was being watched. The comforting silence of the dawn had been replaced by a chilling sense of being observed. His grandfather's paranoia, which he had always seen as a symptom of his illness, suddenly felt like a rational survival instinct. He was not alone in this treasure hunt, and whoever else was out there was now aware of him. Clutching the brass disc in his pocket, Ethan walked quickly away from the park, the thrill of discovery now tainted with a cold, sharp taste of fear. The drive back to the university was a blur of heightened senses and raw paranoia. Every pair of headlights in Ethan's rearview mirror felt like a threat. Every car that stayed behind him for more than 2 blocks seemed to be following him. He took a winding, illogical route through the waking city, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The thrill of his discovery in the park was now overshadowed by the chilling certainty that he had been watched. His grandfather's frantic warnings about shadows with listening ears no longer seemed like the ramblings of a troubled mind. They felt like a prophecy he had carelessly walked into. By the time he reached the familiar Gothic architecture of the Georgetown campus, the sun was fully up, casting a deceptively peaceful morning glow. He hurried to his office, his satchel clutched tightly to his chest. Once inside, he didn't just close the door, he locked it and slid the deadbolt, an action he hadn't taken in his entire decade of working there. He drew the blinds on the single tall window, plunging the room into a dim, artificial twilight. His office, once a cage of academic monotony, now felt like the only safe harbor in the world. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm the frantic rhythm of his heart. He told himself to be rational. He was a historian, a man of facts and evidence. He had no proof he was being followed, only a fleeting sound and a primal feeling. For now, he had to focus on the tangible evidence he held. He carefully unwrapped the brass disc and placed it on his desk beside the enlarged photograph of the dollar bills pyramid. Under the bright, focused light of his desk lamp, the object was a marvel of craftsmanship. It was heavier than it looked, made of a dense, non-tarnishing brass alloy. The symbols were not crudely etched, but engraved with a level of precision that seemed almost impossible for a colonial-era artifact. He saw now that the disc was not one solid piece. It was constructed of 3 concentric rings. The outermost ring was fixed, part of the disc's solid base, but the 2 inner rings could be rotated independently. It was a volvel, a type of complex, historical cipher wheel. It was a machine for thinking. The arrangement of the symbols was now even more baffling. They weren't a path to a location like the symbols on the bill had been. This was something else. This was a lock that required a combination. He tried turning the rings, attempting to align the symbols into some kind of logical pattern, but it was hopeless. There were thousands, perhaps millions, of possible permutations. He was missing the key. Not a physical key, but the instructional key. The logic of the machine. Once again, he turned to the only guide he had, his grandfather's journal. He started searching for any reference to a disc, a wheel, or a compass. After an hour of scanning the dense script, he found it, tucked away in a section on colonial-era astronomy and its links to esoteric societies. Arthur wrote, they would not create a key without a corresponding lock, and they would not create a lock without a guide. I have searched for a second document, a codex, for years, but I now believe I was wrong. The custodians were too clever for that. They didn't use 2 separate documents. They used 2 halves of a whole, designed to work in unison. One is the map, the other is the engine. One is static, the other is kinetic. The truth is found only when the symbols of the pyramid are overlaid upon the lumen circulus, the circle of light. The eye of providence is not just a drawing, it is an instruction. It is the alignment point. Through the eye, all patterns become one. Ethan's eyes widened. Overlaid. The alignment point. He looked at the brass disc. In its exact center was the small, perfectly drilled hole. He looked at his photograph of the dollar bill. Right at the top of the pyramid was the all-seeing eye. His grandfather's meaning crashed into him with the force of a revelation. The disc wasn't a separate puzzle to be solved. It was a device for reading the first puzzle in a new way. The symbols on the dollar bill were the combination. He had to align the rotating rings on the disc to match the pattern of symbols on the pyramid. The central hole on the disc was meant to be placed directly over the eye of providence on the bill, creating a single, unified cipher. A new problem immediately presented itself. This was a task of microscopic precision. The symbols were tiny, and the slightest misalignment would result in a meaningless jumble. He tried using his magnifying glass, holding the photo of the bill under the disc, but his hands were too unsteady. The angles had to be perfect. He was a historian. He had books, maps, and a keen mind, but he lacked the tools and the expertise for this kind of delicate, almost surgical, alignment. He needed a laboratory, not a library. Frustration mounted once again. He had come so far, only to be stopped by the limits of his own skills. He slumped in his chair, feeling the weight of the secret he was carrying. He was utterly alone in this. And then, he remembered his grandfather's paranoia. If someone was indeed watching him, then time was not on his side. He picked up the journal, a desperate hope that he had missed something more. He flipped towards the final pages, the entries written in a shakier hand, from the last years of his grandfather's life. And there it was. A single paragraph, circled multiple times. "My hands are no longer steady enough for the fine work," Arthur wrote. "My mind sees the path, but my body fails me. If this journal falls into your hands, Ethan, and you get this far, you must not make my mistake. Do not let pride and fear keep you isolated. There was one person who listened, who saw the mathematics behind my madness, and did not dismiss it. She works with the past not as a storyteller, but as a scientist. Dr. Evelyn Reed, the Smithsonian. She is a conservationist of historical instruments. She will understand the precision the lumen circulus requires. I do not know if she can be trusted with the full truth, but she can be trusted with the science. Show her the machine. She will know how to make it speak." Ethan stared at the name. Dr. Evelyn Reed, the Smithsonian. It was a tangible lead, a lifeline, but it was also a terrifying risk. For 2 days, this secret had been his and his alone. To share it, even a piece of it, was to lose control. It meant trusting a complete stranger based on the word of a man he had barely known. What if she thought he was insane, just as everyone had thought Arthur was? What if she worked for the very people his grandfather feared? He turned to his computer and typed her name into the university's research database. She was real. Dr. Evelyn Reed, senior conservator at the National Museum of American History, with a PhD in archaeometry, the application of scientific techniques to archaeology and history. Her list of publications was long and impressive, with titles like Metallurgical Analysis of 18th Century Navigational Tools and Non-Invasive Imaging for Artifact Provenance. She was, by all accounts, one of the foremost experts in her field. She was the perfect person to help, and that made her the most dangerous person to ask. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, the cursor blinking on his screen. His grandfather's warning and his grandfather's last hope were at war within him. To continue alone was to risk failure. To ask for help was to risk exposure. The weight of the brass disc in his pocket felt heavier than ever. He had to make a choice. His finger hovered over the mouse, the link to her official contact page glowing on the screen. The solitary quest was over. The question was, what came next? The blinking cursor on the screen was a silent, pulsing metronome, counting down the seconds of Ethan's indecision. To click the link, to write the email, was to cross a point of no return. His instincts, sharpened by the unnerving experience at the park, screamed at him to keep the secret buried. But the historian in him, the rational academic, knew that he was hopelessly out of his depth. The brass disc sat on his desk, a silent testament to his limitations. It was a machine he did not have the tools to operate. With a deep breath that did little to calm his racing heart, he made the choice. He would trust his grandfather's last piece of advice. He didn't call. A call could be dismissed, and he didn't want to risk fumbling his explanation. Instead, he spent nearly an hour composing a carefully worded email. He introduced himself as a professor from Georgetown, researching unconventional cartographic and navigational tools used by colonial-era fraternal societies. He explained that he had come across a peculiar family heirloom, a complex brass disc that seemed to be a type of cipher wheel or volvel, but whose craftsmanship was unusually advanced. He respectfully requested a brief, 20-minute consultation, appealing to her unparalleled expertise in the field. He attached a single tightly cropped photograph of the disc itself, deliberately choosing an angle that showed its complexity without revealing the full pattern of the symbols. He read the email a dozen times, then, before he could lose his nerve, he hit send. The reply came less than an hour later. It was brief and professional. "Professor Hayes, your heirloom is intriguing. The engraving is indeed remarkable. I can make time tomorrow at 10 a.m. My lab is at the Smithsonian Support Center in Maryland. Please bring the object. I will arrange for a visitor's pass at the front security desk. Regards, Dr. Reed." The next morning, Ethan found himself driving to a location that did not appear on any tourist maps of Washington, D.C. The Smithsonian Support Center was a massive, modern, and anonymous-looking complex, a world away from the classical marble facades of the museums on the National Mall. This was the brain of the institution, a place of preservation, research, and science. After a rigorous security check that involved signing forms and receiving a laminated badge, he was escorted through long, sterile white corridors. The air smelled of controlled humidity and faint chemicals, a stark contrast to the familiar scent of old paper in his office. He was led to a heavy steel door marked Artifact Conservation, Section B. The door hissed open to reveal a large, brightly lit laboratory. It was like stepping into the future. Glass cases held artifacts in various states of analysis, and workstations were covered with complex machinery, scanning electron microscopes, X-ray fluorescence spectrometers, and 3D digital imagers. In the center of the room, examining a fragile-looking astrolabe under a powerful articulated lens, was a woman in a white lab coat. "Professor Hayes," she said, looking up. She had sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her hair was tied back practically, and her expression was one of focused, professional neutrality. This was Dr. Evelyn Reed. "Dr. Reed, thank you for seeing me on such short notice," Ethan said, his voice a little shaky. "Your email was compelling," she replied, gesturing towards a clean, steel-topped table. "You've brought the object?" Ethan nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. He reached into his satchel and carefully unwrapped the brass disc, placing it on the cold surface between them. For a moment, Evelyn said nothing. She put on a pair of nitrile gloves, picked up the disc, and held it under a bright, magnified lamp. Her professional neutrality dissolved, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated fascination. "Remarkable," she whispered, turning it over and over in her hands. "The alloy seems to be a form of arsenical bronze, consistent with some 18th century instruments. But the execution, this is not hand-engraved, Professor. Not in any traditional sense. Look." She shifted the disc under a digital microscope connected to a large monitor on the wall. An image of the symbols, magnified 100 times, filled the screen. The lines are too perfect, the angles too precise. The microscopic striations suggest a form of mechanical etching or rotary toolwork that was simply not available in the 1780s. It's an anachronism. A beautiful, impossible anachronism. Ethan's heart pounded. She saw it too. She saw that it was special. "So, you think it's a fake? A modern reproduction?" he asked, his voice betraying his anxiety. Evelyn shook her head, her eyes still glued to the monitor. "No, the opposite. The surface patina, the micro-pitting on the metal. This object has been in the ground for a very long time. It's genuinely old. It just shouldn't exist. It's like finding a jet engine in a pharaoh's tomb." She looked up at him, her scientific curiosity now mixed with a hint of suspicion. "Professor Hayes, where exactly did you say this came from?" This was the moment of truth. The cover story felt thin and foolish under her analytical gaze. He had to give her more, but not everything. He made a calculated risk. "Dr. Reed, the disc is only half of the puzzle," he said, his voice low. He pulled out his phone and brought up a high-resolution, tightly cropped image he had taken of the symbols on the dollar bill's pyramid. He showed it to her, making sure no other part of the bill was visible. "I believe the symbols on the disc are meant to be aligned with another set of symbols, found on a period-specific document." Evelyn looked at the image on his phone, then back at the symbols on the disc under the microscope. She enlarged his photo, comparing the shapes. Her breath hitched almost silently. The symbols were a perfect match in style and form. The historian and the scientist, two halves of a whole, just like the artifacts they were studying. She looked up from the phone, her sharp eyes boring into his. The skepticism was gone, replaced by an intense, unnerving focus. All pretense of a simple academic consultation had vanished. "Professor Hayes," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "This period document, it's currency, isn't it? The spacing, the way the symbols are arranged to fit on what looks like stone blocks. You found this on the Great Seal, on the back of a dollar bill." Ethan was speechless. He simply stared at her. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, a dangerous spark of understanding in her eyes. "My lab can align these two patterns with a precision you can't achieve by hand. But before I apply the resources of this institution to your family heirloom, you need to tell me what you've really stumbled into." The question hung in the sterile air of the lab, heavy with unspoken possibilities. "What is this, Professor? And who else is looking for it?" The sterile air of the laboratory seemed to crackle with the energy of Evelyn's final question. "What is this, Professor? And who else is looking for it?" Her gaze was unblinking, a scientist's stare that demanded data, not evasion. Ethan knew in that moment that his carefully constructed cover story had dissolved. He was standing before a human lie detector, and the only path forward was the truth. Or at least, a version of it she might believe. He took a slow breath, his mind racing to assemble the chaotic events of the past week into a coherent narrative. My grandfather passed away recently, he began, his voice low and steady. He was a brilliant man, an engineer, but he spent the last 40 years of his life consumed. He believed a small group within the Founding Fathers created a sort of historical failsafe, a trail of breadcrumbs leading to something they felt was too important to be left to chance. He called it a covenant. He explained the inheritance, the journal and the single, specific dollar bill. He told her about the microscopic symbols, his initial disbelief, and the methodical process of using the L'Enfant map to find the park. He recounted the discovery of the brass disc, and then he hesitated for a fraction of a second before finishing the story. When I was leaving the park, just before dawn, I'm not certain, but I believe I was being watched. I heard someone. I can't prove it. It could have been my imagination, but it felt real. Evelyn listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. She walked over to a small console and with a few keystrokes, a heavy-duty security shutter rolled down over the lab's main door, sealing them inside with a soft, definitive thud. She then turned back to him. Grandfathers with secret obsessions are not uncommon, Professor, she said, her tone analytical, not dismissive. But a silver certificate with microscopic engravings and a colonial-era cipher wheel made with technology that shouldn't exist, that is evidence. Hard, physical evidence. She tapped a finger on the steel table next to the disc. I'm a scientist. I follow evidence. The story is fantastic, but the artifacts are real. My professional curiosity is now fully engaged. So is my concern for the security of these items. She met his eyes. All right, Professor Hayes. I'll help you, on 2 conditions. First, from this moment on, we operate with complete transparency between us. No more half-truths. Second, this investigation stays within these walls until we know exactly what we're dealing with. No outside communication about this. No more lone trips to parks at dawn. Are we agreed? A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled his knees, washed over Ethan. He wasn't alone anymore. Agreed, Dr. Reed. Call me Evelyn, she said, a hint of a smile touching her lips for the first time. And I'll call you Ethan. Now, let's see what this machine can really do. I'll need the dollar bill. The real one. Leaving Evelyn with the disc in the now sealed lab, Ethan made the tense journey back to his office, retrieved the actual dollar bill from his safe, and returned. The sight of the 2 objects together on Evelyn's cleanroom table was electric. The soft, worn paper of the bill and the hard, gleaming brass of the disc. 2 halves of a whole. What followed was a masterclass in modern science applied to historical mystery. Evelyn placed the dollar bill in a non-contact, high-resolution scanner. A 3-dimensional, micron-level accurate digital model of the bill's surface appeared on the massive monitor. She did the same for the brass disc. Now, she said, we can work with the digital copies. Infinitely precise, and no risk of damaging the originals. She wrote a short piece of code, creating a program that perfectly overlaid the image of the disc on top of the image of the pyramid, aligning the disc's central hole with the pyramid's all-seeing eye. The 2 sets of symbols now intertwined on the screen, a chaotic, meaningless jumble. It's a multi-stage lock, Ethan said, suddenly remembering a passage from the journal. My grandfather wrote, the symbols do not give a word, but a sequence. From the base to the top, follow the path. It's an algorithm. The first symbol on the bill tells you how to align the rings on the disc to find the first letter of the message. The second symbol on the bill tells you how to realign them for the second letter, and so on. Evelyn's fingers flew across her keyboard. A progressive key cipher. Complex, but logical. She configured the program to treat the pyramid symbols, from the bottom step to the top, as a set of instructions. The first symbol from the bill was their input. She digitally rotated the inner rings of the volvel on the screen until the markers aligned. On the outer ring, a single character was illuminated by the software, the letter L. Okay, Evelyn breathed. Now for the second step. She input the second symbol from the pyramid. This time, the instructions were more complex, requiring a counter-rotation of the 2 inner rings. They worked in tandem, Ethan reading the cryptic clues from his grandfather's journal about the symbolic meanings, and Evelyn translating them into degrees of rotation and algorithmic commands. L, I, B, R, A, R, Y. With each solved step, a new letter appeared, the tension in the lab ratcheting up. They were pulling a message from across 2 centuries, letter by painstaking letter. The process was slow, methodical, a digital seance with the ghosts of the Founding Fathers. O, F, C, O, N, G-R-E-S-S. Ethan stared at the screen. The Library of Congress. It wasn't a secret location in a park. It was one of the largest, most secure public institutions on the planet. "We're not done," Evelyn said, her focus absolute. They continued the sequence, the symbols on the pyramid's higher steps yielding not letters, but numbers and another word. After nearly 2 hours of intense, silent work, the final symbol was entered. The full decoded message glowed on the monitor. It read, "Library of Congress, Jefferson's Collection, Accession 818. Silence descended on the lab. The answer they had worked so hard to uncover was not an answer at all, but another, far more formidable question. Thomas Jefferson's personal collection was the original founding core of the Library of Congress, a vast trove of thousands of books and documents. And hidden somewhere within that historic labyrinth was a single item, identified only by a cryptic accession number. Their treasure hunt had just led them out of the shadows and into the heart of a fortress of knowledge, a place with guards, cameras, and 1,000 rules. They had the key. They had the location. But getting inside would be the most dangerous part of the puzzle yet. The 6 words and 3 numbers on the screen glowed in the dim lab, a beacon of clarity that only illuminated how deep the darkness around them truly was. Library of Congress, Jefferson's Collection, Accession 818. They had unlocked the next step, but the path it revealed led directly towards a granite and marble fortress, one of the most revered and secure institutions in the nation. "Well," Evelyn finally said, breaking the silence as she leaned back in her chair. "At least they weren't subtle." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a sense of vertigo washing over him. "Subtle? No. Impossible? Maybe. We can't just walk into the Library of Congress and ask for a secret item from Jefferson's collection using a code we got from a conspiracy theorist's dollar bill." "No," Evelyn agreed, her analytical mind already shifting from decryption to logistics. "We can't. So our first task is to stop thinking of Accession 818 as a standard library call number. It's not in any catalog we'll be able to find." She turned back to her computer, her fingers already flying across the keyboard, navigating through secure academic and archival databases that Ethan had only dreamed of accessing. If it were a real, publicly listed accession number, it would have shown up in a keyword search by now. This is something else. Something off the books. For the next several hours, they threw themselves into the research, a 2-person intelligence agency. Evelyn scoured digital archives, cross-referencing inventories of Jefferson's original 6,487-volume collection, looking for anomalies or gaps in the records. Ethan, back in his element, dove deep into his grandfather's journal once more, searching for any mention of Jefferson or the library. He found it in a dense, almost manic section detailing Jefferson's known passions: architecture, cryptography, and esoteric knowledge. Arthur Hayes theorized that Jefferson, a man who famously edited the Bible to remove all miracles, was not a man who rejected the supernatural, but one who sought to understand and control its underlying principles. "Jefferson didn't just donate a library," Arthur wrote. "He donated a puzzle box. He understood that a nation's true strength lay not in its armies, but in its ideas. And its most powerful ideas, he believed, needed to be protected. He would have created a library within the library, a collection hidden in plain sight, accessible only to those who could solve the introductory riddle. The key would not be in the catalog, it would be in the architecture. The building itself." "The building itself," Ethan murmured aloud. Evelyn looked up from her screen, her eyes tired but sharp. "What was that?" "It's not a call number for a book," Ethan said, a new theory taking shape. "My grandfather was convinced the clues were built into the very structures of the city. What if Accession 818 doesn't refer to an item, but to a location within the library?" Evelyn stopped typing, letting the idea sink in. A physical address inside the building. Bay 818. Shelf 818. Maybe something more discreet, Ethan countered. Jefferson was a man of patterns. Look at Monticello, the University of Virginia. It's all about geometry and order. 818. What could it mean? Evelyn's eyes lit up. The Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress, the original structure, is a masterpiece of Beaux-Arts architecture. It's filled with symbolic art, murals, and ridiculously complex floor plans. If you wanted to hide something architecturally, that would be the place to do it. She stood up, a new energy about her. I have a valid professional reason to be there. I can request a consultation with the curator of the Rare Book and Special Collections Division. I'll say I'm researching 18th century bookbinding techniques and need to see some of Jefferson's original volumes. And while you're there? Ethan asked. I'll be looking for the number 818, she said. Not in a book, but on a shelf, a door, a bay number, a map. I'll be a scientist on a research trip. No one will look twice. The next day, Ethan waited in the lab, a nervous wreck, while Evelyn went on the reconnaissance mission. She had dressed not in her usual lab coat, but in a professional but unassuming business suit, looking every bit the visiting academic. Evelyn found the Library of Congress to be just as majestic and intimidating as she expected. She was met by a senior curator, a kindly, scholarly man named Mr. Abernathy, who led her from the breathtaking Great Hall into the hushed, climate-controlled sanctum of the rare book vaults. The air was cool and smelled of aged leather and acid-free paper. Here, behind reinforced doors, were the surviving treasures of Jefferson's original library. As Abernathy showed her several priceless volumes, explaining the history of their acquisition, Evelyn's eyes were constantly scanning her surroundings. The shelving was modern, metal, and clearly labeled with a complex alphanumeric system. There was no simple 818 to be found. Her heart began to sink. Had they been wrong? "It's remarkable how much has been preserved," she said to the curator, trying to keep her disappointment from her voice. "Are these the original shelves Jefferson would have used?" Abernathy chuckled. "Goodness, no. The originals, what's left of them, are mostly in storage. Jefferson's library was tragically burned in a fire in 1851. We have a small preserved section of the original West Wing shelving in the lower vault, more as a historical exhibit than for active use. It holds some of our larger, more fragile folios. It's right over here." He led her down a narrow corridor to another vault. Inside, the shelving was dark, carved wood, completely different from the modern steel racks. It was a small, preserved corner of the 19th century library, and as Abernathy turned to point out a feature on the wall, Evelyn saw it. On the wooden end cap of one of the tall shelves was a small, faded, painted label, written in an elegant, curling script. It read, Bay 8. Her eyes quickly scanned down the vertical sections of the bay. They were numbered. Near the bottom, holding several massive, leather-bound architectural books, was the section marked 18. Bay 8, Section 18. 8, 1, 8. Her pulse quickened. This was it. This was the location. She wanted to walk over, to pull a book from the shelf, but Abernathy was already turning back, guiding her away. As I was saying, the binding techniques of the period were. Evelyn forced herself to listen, to nod, to ask intelligent questions, her mind racing. She now knew precisely where their target was located. But it was in a secure vault, a historical display, not a public shelf. Getting back in, and getting something out, would be another matter entirely. She thanked the curator and left the library, her mind buzzing with plans. As she stepped out into the bright afternoon sun on the steps of the Jefferson Building, she paused to get her bearings. And then she felt it. A prickling sensation on the back of her neck. The same feeling of being watched that Ethan had described. She casually scanned the flow of tourists and passers-by. Her eyes landed on a man standing across the street, near the Capitol building. He was wearing a simple gray suit, holding a newspaper, but he wasn't reading it. His gaze was fixed directly on her. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. He simply held her gaze for a beat too long, then calmly folded his newspaper, turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. The cold dread that washed over her was absolute. This wasn't a historical puzzle anymore. It was a contemporary threat, and they had just led it straight to their next target. Evelyn walked into the lab so quickly that the heavy security door had barely hissed shut behind her before she was speaking. Her face was pale, and the calm, analytical demeanor she had maintained at the Library of Congress was gone, replaced by a raw, nervous energy. "You were right," she said, her voice tight. "You were absolutely right. I was followed." Ethan, who had been pacing a trench into the lab's linoleum floor, stopped dead. "What happened? Did they approach you? Who was it?" "A man. Gray suit. Looked like 1,000 other government types in this city. He was watching me when I left the Jefferson Building. He didn't do anything, didn't approach. He just watched, to let me know I was seen." She sank into a chair, running a hand over her face. "This changes everything, Ethan. This isn't an academic exercise anymore. We've kicked a hornet's nest, and we have no idea how big it is." The validation of his fears brought Ethan no comfort, only a cold knot of dread in his stomach. The vague paranoia he'd felt was now a confirmed, shared reality. For a long moment, the two of them sat in silence, the hum of the lab's ventilation system filling the void. The artifacts on the table, the ancient bill and the impossible disc, seemed to emanate a new, more sinister aura. They weren't just clues, they were bait. "We should stop," Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper. We can take this to someone. The authorities. The Smithsonian's own security. And tell them what? Ethan countered, his voice regaining its strength. That my dead, conspiracy theorist grandfather left me a coded dollar bill that led us to an impossible artifact? That we decoded it, and now we think we're being followed by men in suits? They'll think we're insane. They'll confiscate the items, lock them in a vault, and this trail will go cold forever. If there's a threat, the only way to neutralize it is to understand it. And the only way to do that is to see this through. He knelt by his satchel and pulled out his grandfather's journal, flipping to a section he had read but not fully understood. My grandfather wrote about two groups. The custodians, who created this puzzle to protect something. But he also mentioned another group, a splinter faction. He called them the Janitors. He said they believed the secret, whatever it is, was too dangerous to be preserved. Their goal wasn't to possess it, but to find it and erase it from history. To clean the slate. Evelyn looked from the journal to Ethan, her scientific mind grappling with the incredible narrative. Janitors, cleaning the slate. So the man watching me, he wasn't trying to see what I know. He was waiting to see what I would lead him to. Exactly, Ethan affirmed. Which means they don't know the location yet. They're following us. We still have the advantage. But not for long. A new resolve hardened Evelyn's expression. The fear was still there, but it was being pushed aside by a scientist's refusal to abandon a problem. Okay, she said, standing up. No authorities. But no more mistakes. No more walking into the lion's den. If we're going to get to Bay 8, Section 18, we need a way to do it without anyone knowing we were ever there. The problem seemed insurmountable. The vault is in a restricted area, Evelyn, Ethan said. You saw it. Keycards, curators, probably silent alarms. The security on the vault door itself is the main obstacle, Evelyn clarified, shifting into logistical mode. She pulled up a schematic of the lab's own security system on a monitor. It will be a magnetic lock tied to the library's central system, requiring a specific high-clearance keycard. We can't bypass it from the outside. A frontal assault is impossible. For the next hour, they brainstormed, coming up with and discarding a dozen impractical schemes. It was Ethan, his mind drifting back to his grandfather's obsession with architecture and hidden infrastructure, who found the thread. The library isn't a standalone building, he said, thinking aloud. It's part of the Capitol Hill complex. There are tunnels, aren't there? Connecting the buildings for senators and staff. Yes, Evelyn confirmed. The Congressional Tunnel System. But it's one of the most heavily surveilled places in D.C. It's a non-starter. Not the modern tunnels, Ethan insisted, moving to a computer. He began searching the Library of Congress's own digital archives, typing in keywords, Jefferson Building, construction, blueprints, subbasement. He pulled up a set of dusty, digitized architectural plans from the building's construction in the 1890s. They built this place over a decade. Look at this. He pointed to a faint, thin line on the schematic for the lowest subbasement. It was a narrow channel, labeled Book Conveyance and Pneumatic Transit. In the early 20th century, they had a system to move books quickly between the library and the Capitol, Ethan explained, his excitement growing. A miniature railway. It was decommissioned in the 1940s when the systems were modernized. Most of it was filled in, but according to these plans, one spur of the tunnel runs directly adjacent to the foundation of the West Wing's lower vaults, right where they store the old Jefferson-era shelving. Evelyn leaned in, her eyes tracing the path on the old blueprint. A ghost tunnel. Unused, unmonitored, a potential back door. She pulled up a modern satellite view of the area, cross-referencing it with the old plans. The tunnel would have had maintenance access points. According to this, the nearest one is here, in a small, gated utility yard behind the Cannon House office building. Barely used, from the looks of it. A plan began to form, a wild and incredibly dangerous strategy born of desperation and historical insight. They wouldn't go through the front door. They would go from underneath. Evelyn would handle the technical aspects. Using her knowledge of sensors and security, she could assemble a small kit to detect or bypass any old, lingering alarm systems they might encounter near the vault wall. Ethan would be the navigator, using the century-old blueprints to guide them through the darkness of the forgotten tunnel. Their target was Bay 8, Section 18. Their entry point was a rusty maintenance hatch in a deserted utility yard. Their path was a tunnel that hadn't seen a human being in over 70 years. This is certifiably insane, Evelyn breathed, looking at the complex, multi-layered plan they had laid out on the screen. I know, Ethan replied, his voice grim but determined. But it's the only plan that doesn't involve a keycard we don't have or a guard we can't get past. We go in late, during the overnight shift change for the Capitol Police, when patrols are at their lightest. They looked at each other, the full weight of their decisions settling upon them. They were no longer academics studying a mystery. They were about to commit a federal crime, breaking into one of the most secure buildings in the world. But there was no turning back. The path was set, and it led down, into the darkness beneath the city. The lab, which had once been a sanctuary of scientific order, was now a tense staging ground. It was just after 2 a.m., the hour when the city of Washington, D.C. holds its breath, caught between the echoes of yesterday and the promise of dawn. Ethan and Evelyn moved with a quiet, focused intensity, their faces illuminated by the glow of a single monitor displaying the 19th century blueprints. They were dressed in dark, practical clothing, stripped of anything that might jingle or reflect the light. Evelyn methodically packed a small, heavy-duty canvas bag. Into it went a collection of tools that looked like they belonged to a spy film. A compact frequency scanner for detecting electronic signals, a multi-tool, a handheld digital borescope with a flexible fiber optic cable, and 2 powerful LED headlamps. Her movements were precise, economical, a scientist preparing for a critical experiment. Ethan's role was less tangible but no less important. He held a ruggedized tablet displaying the tunnel schematics, his eyes tracing their planned route again and again, burning it into his memory. The weight of what they were about to do pressed down on them, thick and suffocating as the humid night air. There was no more debate, no more discussion of the risks. The time for talk was over. They exchanged a single silent nod and slipped out of the lab. The utility yard behind the Cannon House office building was a patch of forgotten urban landscape. Enclosed by a sagging chain-link fence and choked with weeds, it was a blind spot in the otherwise immaculate and heavily monitored Capitol Hill complex. The illuminated dome of the Capitol building loomed over them, a silent, majestic witness to their crime. Evelyn dispatched the simple lock on the gate in under 10 seconds. They crept into the yard, their footsteps silenced by the damp grass. Using the blueprint on the tablet as a guide, Ethan located the maintenance hatch. It was exactly where the plan said it would be, a circular iron plate almost completely obscured by overgrown ivy and a layer of decaying leaves. It hadn't been opened in decades. It took their combined strength, straining against the rusted iron with a crowbar from Evelyn's kit, to break the seal. The hatch groaned open with a deep, percussive shriek that seemed to echo for miles in the dead quiet of the night. They both froze, listening, but the city remained silent. A wave of air, cold and smelling of damp earth, stale metal, and something indefinably ancient, washed over them from the dark opening. This was the smell of a place that time had forgotten. "No turning back now," Evelyn whispered, her voice tight. She clicked on her headlamp, casting a brilliant white beam into the abyss. It illuminated the top of a rusted iron ladder descending into perfect blackness. One by one, they climbed down, the corroded rungs groaning under their weight. When their feet touched the solid floor of the tunnel, they were in another world. The oppressive silence of the city above was replaced by an even deeper, more claustrophobic quiet. The air was heavy and cold. Their headlamps cut cones of light through the darkness, revealing a narrow, brick-lined tube, barely wide enough for them to walk single file. Thick cobwebs, undisturbed for generations, hung like spectral curtains from the ceiling, and the walls were lined with the skeletal remains of old pneumatic tubes and lead-sheathed electrical cables. Ethan took the lead, the tablet in his hands. The blueprints show a straight path for about 200 yards, then a slight curve to the left, he said, his voice a low murmur that the tunnel seemed to swallow. They moved cautiously, their senses on high alert. Every drip of water from the ceiling, every skittering sound in the distant shadows, every crunch of debris under their boots was magnified into a potential threat. Time seemed to warp in the featureless dark, and they had no idea if they had been walking for 10 minutes or an hour when they reached the curve. Just around the bend, they found their first major obstacle. A section of the ceiling had collapsed, filling the tunnel with a mound of dirt and shattered brick. The passage was completely blocked. "This wasn't on the plans," Evelyn stated, shining her light over the rubble. "The collapse doesn't look ancient. The edges are too sharp." The unspoken question hung between them. Was this a natural collapse, or had someone else been down here, creating a deliberate obstruction? They scanned the blockage. To the right, the rubble was packed tight against the wall. But on the left, there was a small, tight gap, a crawl space barely 2 feet high. It was their only way through. Evelyn went first, pushing the gear bag ahead of her as she wriggled through the tight space. Ethan followed, the rough edges of the broken bricks scraping at his back. When they were finally through, they were covered in dust and grime, their hearts pounding from the exertion and the claustrophobia. They pressed on, and after another 50 yards of tense, silent walking, Ethan stopped. He pointed his light to the wall on their right. "This is it," he said. According to the blueprint, the lower vault of the Library of Congress was just on the other side of this wall. The brickwork here was subtly different, the mortar cleaner, newer, indicating a reinforced foundation. Evelyn took over. She unpacked her tools, her scientific precision a calming force in the oppressive darkness. She ran a device over the wall, a faint hum the only sound. The foundation is solid granite, but the mortar between the blocks is from the original 1890s construction. There's a spot here, it's softer. I think it's where they sealed an old service conduit. She selected a long, thin bit for her quiet, battery-powered drill. I'm going to drill a small pilot hole, just big enough for the borescope. No alarms, no noise. The drill whirred almost silently, biting into the old mortar. After a few tense minutes, it broke through. Evelyn extracted the bit and uncoiled the fiber optic cable of the borescope, feeding it carefully into the tiny hole. She switched it on, and the screen of the handheld viewer flickered to life. "I'm in," she whispered. On the small screen, a ghostly, night vision image appeared. It was the interior of the vault. They could make out the dark, towering shapes of the wooden shelves. Evelyn manipulated the camera, panning slowly across the silent space. The beam from the scope's tiny LED caught the faded paint on a wooden end cap. Bay 8. Ethan held his breath. Evelyn moved the camera lower, along the shelves of Section 18. They could see the spines of the massive leather-bound books, just as the curator had described. Their goal was within reach. "Wait," Evelyn breathed, freezing the camera's movement. "What is that?" She zoomed in. At the bottom of the shelf, running along the floor, was something that did not belong. It was a thin, dark line, barely visible against the stone floor. As the camera's light caught it from a different angle, it glinted with a faint, crimson sheen. It was a modern, hair-thin filament. A laser tripwire. A silent, sophisticated alarm. Their back door, their secret path, had been a trap all along. Someone else knew about this place. And they were waiting. The image on the borescope's small screen glowed with a malevolent red line, a digital scar drawn across their hopes. For a full 10 seconds, neither Ethan nor Evelyn moved or spoke. They were frozen in the suffocating darkness of the tunnel, the silence broken only by the sound of their own frantic heartbeats. The secret path they had so brilliantly discovered was not a path at all. It was a snare, laid by an enemy who was not only aware of the game, but was actively playing it. "Pull it out," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. "Pull the camera out now. We have to go." The instinct to flee was overwhelming. They were caught, outmaneuvered. Every moment they spent here increased their chances of being found. "No, wait," Evelyn breathed, her eyes narrowed in concentration, her fear being rapidly replaced by a cold, scientific fury. "Don't panic. Let's analyze this." She manipulated the camera, tracing the path of the laser. It's a single-beam tripwire. Battery-powered, most likely. Not connected to the library's main grid, or it would have shown up on my pre-scan of the building's ambient frequencies. It's designed to trigger a silent alarm, probably a radio signal to a receiver somewhere nearby. She zoomed in on the beam's origin point. It's a self-contained system. Professional, but specific. It's a perimeter alarm, designed to stop someone from physically stepping in front of that shelf. But the trap's designer made an assumption. What assumption? Ethan asked, his voice still tense. They assumed whoever came for this would come through the vault door, Evelyn explained. They never imagined someone would be drilling a hole through 2 feet of 19th century granite foundation. The trap protects the floor space. It doesn't protect the shelf itself from remote access. A spark of insane hope ignited in Ethan's chest. "You mean, we can still get to it?" "It's a long shot," Evelyn admitted, "and incredibly risky. But turning back now means they win. They'll know someone tried to get in, and they'll move whatever is on that shelf. This is our only chance." The decision was made in that silent exchange of looks. They had come too far to be stopped by a single red line. The first problem was identifying their target. Which book held the next clue? Ethan closed his eyes, forcing his mind back to his grandfather's journal, sifting through the chaotic pages in his memory. He recalled a strange, cryptic line he had skimmed over, dismissing it as poetic nonsense. "Among the maps of the world," his grandfather had written, "find the one that is not of this world. The key lies in Jefferson's celestial folly." Jefferson's celestial folly, Ethan repeated aloud. He wasn't just a politician, he was an astronomer. An avid one. "We're not looking for a terrestrial atlas. We're looking for a star chart." Evelyn carefully maneuvered the borescope, panning its tiny light across the leather spines of the books on Section 18. The titles were faded, written in elegant gold leaf script, a cartography of the New World, surveys of the Virginia Territory, an atlas of European capitals. Then, on the far right, was a volume whose spine was darker than the rest, the title almost completely worn away. By tilting the camera to just the right angle, they could just make out the faint, embossed letters. The title wasn't in English, but Latin. Speculum Mundi Caelestis. The mirror of the celestial world, Ethan translated, his voice filled with awe. That has to be it. Now they had a target. The next problem was retrieval. The hole is too small to get anything through, Ethan said. For now, Evelyn replied. She swapped the drill bit for a small, diamond-dusted manual reamer from her kit. The process was agonizingly slow. With painstaking care, she began to widen the hole in the mortar, a millimeter at a time, turning the handle by hand to make as little noise as possible. The soft, grating sound of the tool against the old mortar was the only sound in the universe. After what felt like an eternity, the hole was just over 2 inches in diameter. Evelyn then unpacked the final, most audacious piece of her equipment, a collapsible, remote-controlled retrieval arm. Folded up, it was a slim metal rod. As she worked the controls, it telescoped out, a miniature 3-pronged claw at its end. I use this for handling chemically unstable artifacts in sealed containers, she whispered. Hopefully, it's strong enough to handle a 20-pound book. With the intense focus of a surgeon, she fed the collapsed arm through the widened hole. Ethan watched on the borescope's monitor as the claw emerged into the vault on the other side. Evelyn expertly guided it, the metal arm extending slowly across the 3-foot gap toward the target. The claw opened, its metal fingers hovering over the spine of the ancient star chart. Okay, she breathed. I'm going for the grip. The claw descended, closing around the top of the book's thick spine. It held. Slowly, with movements so minute they were almost imperceptible, Evelyn began to slide the heavy folio off the shelf. The book groaned in protest, the sound of old leather scraping against dry wood. It cleared the shelf, suspended in the air by the thin metal arm. But the weight was more than she anticipated. The arm sagged, the motors in its joints straining. The book tilted downwards, its heavy front cover swinging slowly, like the pendulum of a clock. It dipped lower and lower, its bottom corner dropping directly towards the pencil-thin beam of red light. Evelyn! Ethan hissed. She tried to compensate, to raise the arm, but it was too slow. On the monitor, they watched in horror as the corner of the book plunged through the laser beam, its shadow momentarily eclipsing the crimson filament. They froze. Every muscle in their bodies went rigid. They were listening for the slightest sound, a distant alarm, the slam of a door, the sound of running footsteps from the end of the tunnel. But there was nothing. Only the oppressive, ringing silence of the tomb-like darkness and the image on the screen of the book, hanging perfectly still, its corner now resting a fraction of an inch below the laser, safely on the other side. For one terrifying, heart-stopping moment, they had touched the blade of the guillotine, and it had not fallen. Time seemed to stretch and distort in the suffocating silence of the tunnel. For an agonizing second that felt like a lifetime, Ethan and Evelyn remained utterly motionless, their eyes locked on the monitor, waiting for the consequences of their mistake. The image was stark, the ancient book's corner hanging just below the thin red line of the laser. They listened, their ears straining against the silence for the distant sound of an alarm, the approaching thunder of running feet. Nothing. The tunnel remained as silent and still as a tomb. How? Ethan finally managed to whisper, his voice hoarse. Linger trigger, Evelyn breathed, her mind instantly processing the data. The beam has to be broken for a set duration, maybe half a second, to avoid false positives from dust or falling debris. The book's corner passed through too quickly. We were lucky. Unbelievably, stupidly lucky. The spell of paralysis was broken. Adrenaline, sharp and potent, surged through them. Get it out. Now, Ethan urged. With a newfound urgency, Evelyn masterfully worked the controls. The retrieval arm, still straining under the weight, slowly pulled the heavy book back towards the wall. Getting it through the small, circular hole was a clumsy, awkward process. The book's corners scraped against the rough mortar, and for one heart-stopping moment, it snagged, refusing to move. But with a final, careful maneuver, Evelyn pulled it free. The ancient, leather-bound folio slid through the opening and landed with a soft, heavy thud on the dusty floor of the tunnel at their feet. They had it. There was no time for triumph. Evelyn retracted the arm, packed the gear, and in less than a minute, they were moving, scrambling back the way they came. The journey back was a frantic, paranoid ordeal. The tunnel no longer felt ancient and forgotten. It felt alive with menace. Every shadow seemed to conceal a waiting figure. Every echo sounded like a footstep behind them. The crawl space through the collapsed section felt tighter, more threatening, as if the tunnel itself were trying to trap them. When they finally reached the base of the iron ladder, they didn't hesitate. They scrambled up into the cool, clean air of the pre-dawn city. The sky was turning from black to a soft, bruised purple. They sealed the heavy maintenance hatch, scattered leaves and debris over it to hide their tracks, and slipped back through the gate of the utility yard. The drive back to the Smithsonian Support Center was a silent, high-tension affair, Ethan in the passenger seat clutching the heavy, stolen book to his chest as if it were a life raft. Only when the lab's heavy security door had hissed shut and sealed behind them did they finally allow themselves to breathe. They were safe. For now. They hadn't been caught. They had succeeded. In the center of the brightly lit, sterile lab, the book looked like an object from another dimension. It was massive, bound in cracked, dark brown leather, and held shut by two thick brass clasps greened with age. The title, Speculum Mundi Caelestis, was barely visible, a ghost of its former golden glory. It smelled of centuries of dust, of solitude, and of secrets. Jefferson's Celestial Folly, Ethan said with a sense of reverence, his fingers tracing the edge of the cover. With a delicate touch, Evelyn undid the heavy clasps. They creaked open, and she lifted the cover. The pages within were not paper, but thick, vellum-like parchment, yellowed with age but miraculously preserved. They turned the first page. It was a stunningly detailed hand-painted diagram of the solar system, but it was centered on the sun, a heliocentric model that was still a matter of some debate in Jefferson's time. As they carefully turned more pages, they found themselves lost in a universe that was both familiar and strangely alien. The book was filled with star charts of breathtaking beauty and precision. But the constellations were wrong. Orion the Hunter had an extra star in his belt. The Big Dipper was connected by faint lines to Polaris, forming a complex geometric shape. And interwoven between the stars were the same elegant, mysterious symbols they had seen on the dollar bill and the brass disc. "It's another cipher," Evelyn stated, her voice filled with a scientist's awe. "The star charts themselves are a code. But what do they decode?" Ethan wondered aloud, gently turning a page showing a map of the southern sky. Every other clue has been two halves of a whole. The pyramid on the bill needed the disc. The cipher on the disc needed the sequence from the bill. What's the other half of this? His gaze fell upon the high-resolution image of the dollar bill still displayed on one of the lab's monitors. He had been so focused on the pyramid on the back left side of the bill that he had almost forgotten what was on the right. The eagle, the symbol of the United States. And above the eagle's head, a crest of 13 stars, arranged in a hexagram, a Star of David. "Evelyn," he said, his voice rising with excitement. "Look." He pointed to the screen. 13 stars. A very specific pattern. He then looked down at the book, which was open to a vast, sprawling chart of the northern celestial hemisphere. "We've been looking at the details. We need to look for the pattern." They both leaned over the ancient map, scanning the thousands of tiny, hand-inked stars. And then they saw it. Near the center of the page, almost lost in the dazzling complexity of the chart, was a cluster of 13 bright stars. Their position and arrangement were an exact, perfect match for the 13 stars in the crest above the eagle on the Great Seal. A profound realization dawned on them. The star chart in the book was the master map. The 13 stars on the dollar bill were the key, a stencil, a window to be laid over the proper page. Ethan grabbed a transparent pane of plastic and a marker. He carefully traced the star pattern from the monitor, then laid the transparency over the page in the book, aligning the pattern perfectly. And in that moment, the next layer of the puzzle revealed itself. The pattern on the dollar bill was an outline. But within that outline on the book's map were dozens of other, fainter stars and symbols that were not on the dollar bill at all. They had been hidden in plain sight. These were not random celestial bodies. They were a new set of coordinates, points on a map far more complex than anything they had imagined. The dollar bill hadn't just been a key to a map of Washington, D.C. It was also the key to a map of the heavens. And those heavens, they now suspected, were about to lead them to their final destination. The lab was once again a sanctuary of intense, focused work, but the atmosphere had shifted. The frantic, hunted energy of the past 24 hours was gone, replaced by the profound, reverent quiet of discovery. The ancient celestial atlas lay open on the central table, its pages seeming to absorb the lab's modern, sterile light and radiate a soft, timeless glow. 4 hours, Ethan and Evelyn worked, a seamless fusion of historical intuition and scientific precision. Evelyn carefully photographed each star chart with a high-resolution, multi-spectrum camera, uploading the images into the lab's powerful computer system. The data flowed onto her monitors, a river of ancient ink and parchment rendered in pixels. Her first task was to identify the stars themselves. "This is impossible," she murmured, an hour into her analysis. "Absolutely impossible. What is it?" Ethan asked, looking up from the journal, which he was scouring for any mention of astronomy. These charts, they're not just symbolically rearranged. They're scientifically anachronistic, she explained, pointing to a cluster of faint smudges on the screen. This, for example. The book depicts it as a complex nebula. But the Crab Nebula wasn't properly identified as the remnant of a supernova until the 20th century. And this point here, she indicated another symbol, corresponds to the location of Cygnus X1, a black hole we didn't even have a theoretical framework for until the 1960s. This book contains astronomical knowledge that is centuries ahead of its time. Jefferson didn't write this. It's almost as if he found it. The mystery deepened with every passing moment. This book wasn't just a code, it was a repository of impossible knowledge. Their next step was to decipher the new pattern revealed by the dollar bill's 13-star crest. Evelyn's software projected the stellar stencil over the master chart, isolating the dozens of fainter stars and symbols that constituted the next message. Okay, Evelyn said, thinking aloud. The pyramid coordinates gave us a terrestrial location. It's logical to assume these stellar coordinates will do the same. The question is, where on Earth, and at what point in history, would the night sky look exactly like this? She initiated a complex archaeoastronomy program, designed to cross-reference star charts with geographical locations and historical dates. The computer began to churn through trillions of calculations, attempting to find a match. For 2 hours, they watched it work, and for 2 hours, it failed. It scanned every point on the globe, across 4,000 years of history. The result was always the same, no match found. Frustrated, Evelyn leaned back. It doesn't make sense. There is no vantage point on Earth from which the stars have ever been arranged in this pattern. It's a map to a place that doesn't exist. A thought sparked in Ethan's mind, a connection to his grandfather's central thesis. The custodians weren't just hiding a location, he said slowly. They were preserving a piece of knowledge. The pyramid, a symbol of human construction, led to a physical place. But the stars, the heavens, that's a symbol of divine or cosmic design. What if the star chart isn't a map to a place, but a blueprint for a thing? Evelyn stared at him, her expression shifting from frustration to dawning comprehension. A schematic. The stars are the nodes, the connecting lines are the pathways. It was a radical leap of logic, but it was the only one that fit the paradoxical evidence. She abandoned the mapping software and opened a program used for 3D molecular modeling and structural engineering. She fed the same data into the new system, defining the stars as points in three-dimensional space and the lines between them as structural connections. She hit the render command. On the main screen, a wireframe image began to take shape. At first, it was a chaotic jumble of lines and points. But as the software interpreted the complex geometry, a structure began to emerge from the chaos. It was elegant, symmetrical, and utterly alien. It was a sphere, comprised of interlocking, concentric rings, like a gyroscope of incredible complexity. The rings were covered in the now familiar symbols. And suspended in the very center of the structure, held in place by a delicate-looking energy field, was a crystalline object that seemed to absorb and refract the light of the simulation. It was a machine. A blueprint for an impossible machine. As they stared, utterly mesmerized, Ethan's phone, which he had been using to photograph pages of the journal, buzzed. He had run a text recognition program on the photos, and it had finally cracked a short, coded passage in the journal's final pages, a passage that had used symbols from the celestial atlas itself as its key. He read the decrypted text aloud, his voice trembling. It is not a treasure of gold they guarded, but of light. They called it the keystone, for it locks together the seen and the unseen. I believe it is a machine that interacts with the very fabric of reality, an engine of providence. In the wrong hands, it could rewrite history. In the hands of the janitors, it would be utterly destroyed, a priceless piece of wisdom lost to ignorance and fear. I sought it my whole life, but the final step always eluded me. I know now the location is not hidden in the cosmos. It is hidden in our own story, with the man who was first entrusted with the secret. The weight of the words fell upon them. This was the endgame, a device of unimaginable power, and they were standing between a faction that wanted to preserve it and another that wanted to erase it. They looked from the journal to the 3D model of the machine rotating silently on the screen. The secret was out. But where was the machine itself? The final sentence of his grandfather's message was the final clue. The man who was first entrusted with the secret. Jefferson wasn't the first, Evelyn said, putting the pieces together. He was a link in the chain. The symbols, the societies, this all goes back further. To the beginning, Ethan affirmed. He thought of the key figures of the American Revolution, the men at the center of the Masonic lodges and intellectual circles where these secrets would have been shared. The first custodian. the first American to truly understand what they had found. His mind raced past the obvious candidates. A name suddenly clicked into place, a man known as much for his scientific curiosity and esoteric interests as for his statesmanship. A man who embodied the fusion of science, politics, and mystery. Franklin, Ethan whispered. It has to be Benjamin Franklin. The hunt for a historical artifact was over. They were now searching for a piece of impossible technology, and the final map was hidden somewhere in the life and legacy of America's original Renaissance man. The ghostly three-dimensional model of the keystone rotated silently on the main screen, a constant, mesmerizing reminder of the true stakes. The game had changed. They were no longer searching for a historical secret or a hidden treasure. They were hunting for a piece of impossible science, a device that promised to redefine the laws of physics, and they were in a desperate race against an enemy that wanted to see it annihilated. Their new, singular focus was the man his grandfather's journal had named as the first custodian, Benjamin Franklin. The immediate problem, they quickly discovered, was one of overwhelming information. Franklin's life was a vast ocean of data. He was a statesman, scientist, inventor, printer, and philosopher. He left behind a staggering volume of letters, essays, scientific notes, and public records. The final clue to the keystone's location could be hidden anywhere within that mountain of legacy. A direct search was impossible. It would be like trying to find a single grain of sand on a beach. We have to narrow the parameters, Evelyn said, pacing in front of a whiteboard where she had started to map out the key phases of Franklin's life. The clue will follow the pattern of the others. It will be hidden, likely in plain sight. It will involve duality, a key and a lock. And it will be related to one of his more esoteric interests, not his mainstream political work. They divided his life into the most likely categories. His groundbreaking experiments with electricity and light seemed a strong possibility, given the journal's description of the keystone as a treasure of light. His diplomatic missions in France put him at the heart of Europe's most influential secret societies. But it was his first and perhaps truest passion that held Ethan's focus, printing. Ethan turned once again to the digital archive of his grandfather's journal, searching for every instance of Franklin's name. He found a section that was less a historical analysis and more a study of Franklin the craftsman. Arthur Hayes had been fascinated with Franklin's print shop, believing Franklin used it to embed secret messages in his work. He wrote of hidden watermarks in the paper, of subtle variations in the typefaces, and of specific decorative page ornaments that were, in fact, complex symbols. Tucked into the notes was a quote Arthur had attributed to a private letter of Franklin's. He famously wrote, "3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead," the journal read. But in a letter to a fellow lodge member, he allegedly added a crucial addendum, "and the third prints it where only a true brother may perceive it." "Brother," Ethan said, looking up from the screen. "It's a Masonic reference." Unquestionably, the ocean of information shrank to a manageable lake. They were no longer looking at all of Franklin's work, but only the things he had printed for his fellow Freemasons. As the former Grand Master of the St. John's Lodge in Philadelphia, Franklin had printed a number of official documents for the fraternity. Evelyn's access to academic databases and museum networks, combined with Ethan's historical knowledge, allowed them to quickly assemble a list. Their search soon centered on a single, landmark publication. In 1734, Benjamin Franklin printed the first Masonic book in America, a reprint of James Anderson's The Constitutions of the Freemasons. It was a foundational text for Freemasonry in the colonies, a book that every member of the lodge would have known and respected. "This has to be it," Ethan declared, pointing to a digitized image of the book's title page. "It's the perfect hiding place." A book about secrets and brotherhood, printed by the first custodian himself, and distributed to the very men who would have been part of the conspiracy. According to the Union catalog, there are 17 known copies of the 1734 Franklin edition in existence, Evelyn reported, reading from her monitor. They're scattered across the country. Yale, the Huntington Library, the American Antiquarian Society. "Which one?" Ethan asked. "How do we know which copy holds the clue?" The journal held the final piece of the puzzle. In his notes, Arthur had written that the clue would not be in a copy intended for the public, nor even for a regular lodge member. It would be in the copy belonging to the lodge itself, the one presented to the worshipful master, the copy that would have been preserved in their own sacred archives. Evelyn's fingers flew across the keyboard. The archives of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania are located at the Masonic Temple in Philadelphia. According to their public catalog, they hold a pristine 1734 Franklin Constitutions in their most secure collection. It's listed as the St. John's Lodge Presentation Copy. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, the home of Benjamin Franklin. It was all clicking into place. Their next destination was clear. But as the path forward materialized, a new insidious threat made itself known. An alert, a small red icon, began to flash in the corner of Evelyn's main monitor. It was a notification from the lab's deep-level security software. "What is that?" Ethan asked. Evelyn's face went grim. "It's an intrusion alert. Not a brute force attack, something far more sophisticated. Someone has been pinging our network's firewall, sending out tiny, encrypted data packets, looking for a vulnerability." She brought up a complex diagnostic screen. The signal is heavily cloaked, bouncing through a dozen proxy servers, but the origin signature is military grade. This isn't some random hacker. The Janitors. The realization hit them both at the same time. Their enemies weren't just following them on the streets anymore. They were actively trying to breach their digital sanctuary. They were hunting them on every possible front. "How long do we have?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "There's no way to know," Evelyn replied, her fingers typing furiously as she worked to reinforce the lab's defenses. "They haven't gotten through yet. But this is a clear escalation. They're getting closer. They're tired of waiting for us to lead them to the prize." The clock was ticking, louder than ever before. Their destination was Philadelphia, and their target was Franklin's book, hidden within the walls of the famously secretive Masonic Temple. But their enemies were no longer just a few steps behind them. They were at the door, testing the lock. The flashing red icon on Evelyn's monitor was a digital heartbeat, a constant, unnerving reminder that their sanctuary was under siege. For nearly an hour, Evelyn's fingers were a blur on the keyboard, her face bathed in the glow of cascading lines of code. She was a digital warrior, defending the lab's network against a ghost. She erected firewalls, rerouted data through encrypted proxies, and laid digital traps for their unseen enemy. Finally, the flashing icon subsided, replaced by a steady, green light. "I've locked them out," she announced, the tension easing slightly from her shoulders. "I've created a recursive security loop that will keep their algorithms busy for a while." But that was just a probe, a sophisticated one. They were testing our defenses. They'll be back, and with more force next time. She turned to face Ethan, her expression grim. "This lab is no longer safe. We're digitally exposed. We have to assume they could eventually gain access to the security cameras, the network logs, everything. We need to go." "Go where?" Ethan asked. "The Janitors are physically looking for us, and now they're digitally hunting us. We're running out of places to hide." "We don't hide," Evelyn countered, her voice hardening with resolve. "We attack. We get to the book in Philadelphia before they can regroup. But we have to go off the grid. Completely." Their new strategy was born of this necessity. They packed a single, durable duffel bag with the essential, non-electronic tools from Evelyn's kit. Into a separate, heavily padded case went the three artifacts that had come to define their lives: the silver certificate dollar bill, the brass cipher disc, and the massive, ancient celestial atlas. Evelyn then took a powerful electromagnet and wiped the hard drives of her lab computers, destroying all the local data they had collected. The master files were on a small, encrypted solid-state drive that she kept on her person. They left their personal cell phones and credit cards locked in the lab's safe. From this moment on, they would be ghosts, operating with cash and untraceable burner phones. The most difficult challenge remained. "The Masonic Temple in Philadelphia isn't a public library," Ethan said, thinking through the problem. "It's the headquarters of a private, historically secretive organization. We can't break in. The security, both official and unofficial, would be unlike anything we've faced. We need an invitation." This was not a problem for a scientist, but for a historian. It was Ethan's turn to devise the key. "I can't go in as a treasure hunter," he began, formulating a plan. "But I can go in as myself, Dr. Ethan Hayes, Professor of American History, Georgetown University. I'll request access through official, academic channels." "They'll vet you," Evelyn warned. "They'll see you're a legitimate historian, but why would they show a random professor their most prized artifact?" "Because my request will be so specific, so academic, and so mind-numbingly dull that it will be completely believable," Ethan explained, a sly confidence in his voice. "I won't ask to see Franklin's constitutions to look for a secret map. I'll ask to see it because I'm writing a paper on the socio-political impact of Caslin typeface variations in colonial-era printing. The Franklin book is one of the most famous American examples of Caslin type. It's the perfect cover. It was brilliant. He would use his real identity and his real profession as the ultimate disguise. He spent an hour drafting a formal, scholarly email to the librarian of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. He then followed up with a phone call, using one of their new burner phones. The voice that answered was that of an elderly man, his tone formal and cautious. Ethan launched into his well-rehearsed academic pitch. The librarian, a Mr. Peterson, was polite but firm. Access to the St. John's Lodge copy was granted only under extraordinary circumstances. I understand completely, Ethan said, playing his final card. My research, however, focuses on a specific theory that Franklin may have used a unique, custom ligature, a sort of printer's flourish, in the presentation copies of his most important works. Finding such a mark in your copy would be a significant, though admittedly niche, historical discovery. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Ethan had gambled that the librarian was not just a gatekeeper, but a true historian at heart. The bait of a new small discovery about Benjamin Franklin was too tempting to ignore. A printer's flourish. Mr. Peterson mused, his interest clearly piqued. Very well, Professor. I can grant you a short, supervised viewing. Tomorrow afternoon. Be at the main entrance at 2 p.m. sharp. They had their invitation. They left the lab without a backwards glance, taking a rental car paid for with cash. The drive to Philadelphia was a strange mix of urgency and quiet reflection. They were fugitives, cut off from their normal lives, heading towards a fortress of secrets, being hunted by a shadowy organization. And yet, for the first time, they felt they were on the offensive, moving toward the heart of the mystery. They arrived in the city as the sun began to set. They found an old non-chain motel on the outskirts of the city, again paying with cash. From their window, they couldn't see it, but they could feel its presence downtown. The Masonic Temple, an ornate, imposing structure that was both a public landmark and a private world. Their meticulously crafted cover story would get them through the front door. But as they prepared for the next day's encounter, a single chilling thought hung in the air. Their academic cover was perfect for the librarians and historians. But it would be utterly useless against the janitors, who could be waiting for them anywhere, or even, impossibly, be waiting for them on the inside. The Masonic Temple of Philadelphia was not a building, it was a statement. A colossal, ornate structure of granite and sandstone. It stood in the heart of the city like a cathedral dedicated to a faith of symbols and secrets. As Ethan and Evelyn approached the grand entrance at 2 p.m. the following day, they felt the full weight of their deception. They were academics about to give the performance of their lives. They were met in the opulent lobby by Mr. Peterson, the librarian. He was a small, bird-like man in his late 70s, with a crisp bow tie and spectacles that seemed permanently perched on the end of his nose. His handshake was dry and formal, his eyes sharp and appraising. "Professor Hayes, a pleasure," he said, his voice a dry rustle of paper. "And this is your research assistant, Dr. Evelyn Reed." Evelyn introduced herself, extending a hand. "My work is in materials analysis. I'm assisting the professor with paper and ink composition." Mr. Peterson nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Very well. If you'll follow me. Our archives are not typically open for viewing, but your area of inquiry is quite specific." He led them not on a direct path, but on a winding tour through the temple's famous ceremonial halls. Each room was a breathtaking, immersive world. They walked through a hall designed to look like an ancient Egyptian temple, its columns covered in hieroglyphs. They passed through a Gothic hall that could have been plucked from a medieval cathedral, and a Moorish hall of stunningly intricate tile work. The air was thick with the scent of floor polish, old wood, and history. It was a deliberate display of power and legacy, and Ethan understood its unspoken message: "You are in our world now." Finally, they arrived at a heavy, unmarked oak door. Mr. Peterson produced a brass key and unlocked it, leading them into a small, climate-controlled archive. The room was lined with glass-fronted bookcases, each filled with priceless, leather-bound volumes. In the center of the room was a large, felt-covered table. "Please place your bags by the door," Mr. Peterson instructed. "You may use your camera, Dr. Reed, but no flash. And you will wear these." He handed them each a pair of white cotton gloves. With the reverence of a high priest at an altar, he retrieved the book. The St. John's Lodge presentation copy of the 1734 Constitutions was beautiful. Its calfskin leather binding was rich and dark, and the gold leaf on the spine, though faded, was still elegant. Mr. Peterson laid it carefully in a padded book cradle on the table. "You have 1 hour, Professor," he said, before taking a seat in a chair against the far wall, his hands folded in his lap. He was their host and their warden. The pressure was immense. Ethan and Evelyn began their charade. Ethan leaned over the book with a large magnifying glass, making soft, appreciative noises. "Remarkable," he murmured. "The clarity of the Caslin type is extraordinary for a colonial press. You can see the slight variations in the lowercase s." He was talking to Mr. Peterson, but his eyes were desperately scanning the page, looking for anything, a pinprick, a slightly different letter, a watermark. Evelyn set up a small, specialized digital camera on a tripod, taking meticulous, high-resolution photos of the pages. "The paper stock is fascinating," she commented professionally. "A very high rad content. It's held up beautifully." They worked their way through the book, page by painstaking page. 45 minutes passed. They had found nothing. The book was perfect, pristine, and utterly silent. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat, a gentle reminder that their time was running out. Panic began to creep into Ethan's mind. Had they been wrong? Was the clue somewhere else entirely? He forced himself to think, to go back to his grandfather's notes. He saw the page not as a flat surface, but as a landscape. The truth is not in the ink, but in the impression. Impression. The physical indentation of the metal type into the soft parchment. "Mr. Peterson," Ethan said, his voice calm despite his racing heart. "May I ask Dr. Reed to take one final type of photograph? A raking light shot. By placing the light source at a low angle, we can study the depth of the type's impression on the page. It's a key part of my research into Franklin's press techniques." The librarian considered it for a moment, then gave a curt nod. It was a sound academic request. Evelyn repositioned the small LED light source, placing it nearly parallel to the page. Suddenly, the flat, two-dimensional text was transformed into a miniature landscape of hills and valleys. And on page 52, they saw it. Most of the page was uniform, the type having pressed evenly into the parchment. But a single paragraph in the middle of the page was different. The letters in this paragraph were pressed infinitesimally deeper into the paper, casting shadows so slight they were invisible to the naked eye under normal light. It was the clue. "Quickly," Ethan whispered to Evelyn, while pretending to point something out to Mr. Peterson. "Get the shot." Evelyn's camera clicked, capturing the image in perfect, high-resolution detail. The deeper pressed letters, though scattered throughout the paragraph, were now clearly visible in the photograph's topography. It was a hidden message, spelled out by pressure alone. "Our hour is up, Professor," Mr. Peterson said, standing. "Of course. Thank you for your invaluable assistance," Ethan said graciously, his mind reeling. They had the clue. Mr. Peterson locked the book away and escorted them back out through the grand halls. As they passed through the main lobby, heading for the exit, a tour group was just finishing their own visit. Ethan's eyes scanned the group out of habit, a lingering paranoia from the past few days. And then he saw him. Standing near the back of the group, examining a portrait of George Washington, was a man in a simple, dark gray suit. He was of average height and build, utterly forgettable, except for the cold, watchful stillness about him. When he turned his head slightly, Ethan saw the same impassive, focused expression that Evelyn had described seeing outside the Library of Congress. It was one of them. A janitor. He wasn't outside, waiting. He was inside the temple with them. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's air conditioning. They had the photo with the hidden message. But their enemy was no longer a distant threat on the horizon. He was in the same room, breathing the same air, separated from them by a handful of unsuspecting tourists. The escape had just become the most dangerous part of the mission. The sight of the janitor, a calm island of menace in the bustling temple lobby, sent a jolt of ice water through Ethan's veins. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to grab Evelyn and bolt for the door. But he knew that any sudden movement, any sign of recognition, would be a fatal mistake. The man wasn't approaching. He was observing, waiting to see if his presence had been noted. Ethan forced himself to break eye contact, turning to Evelyn with a relaxed, academic smile he did not feel. "A fascinating building. Shall we?" he said, his voice a marvel of control. Evelyn, who had been watching Ethan's face, immediately understood. Without a single glance towards the janitor, she nodded. "Yes. We should probably find a place to grab a coffee and collate our notes." Their words were a performance for any listening ears, but their movements were a carefully orchestrated retreat. They walked, not ran, towards the massive front doors. They moved like tourists, casually admiring the architecture, but every step was charged with a desperate, silent urgency. Behind them, Ethan could feel the man's attention shift. He could feel the weight of his gaze as he detached from the tour group and began to follow. Once outside on the busy Philadelphia street, the feeling of being hunted intensified. The janitor was 30 yards back, a gray ghost in their periphery, matching their pace perfectly. "He's with us," Ethan murmured, staring straight ahead. "Don't look back," Evelyn commanded in a low, steady voice. "He's trying to spook us into making a mistake. We need a crowd. A big one. Reading Terminal Market is 2 blocks north. We go in, we get lost, we come out a different exit. Go." They turned the corner, their pace quickening from a stroll to a brisk, purposeful walk. The entrance to Reading Terminal Market was a whirlwind of activity. They plunged into the chaos, the air hitting them in a wave, a cacophony of vendors shouting, bells ringing, and the rich, overlapping smells of roasting meat, fresh produce, and baked goods. The market was a labyrinth of people and stalls, a perfect urban forest to lose a predator. They moved with intention, ducking behind a knot of indecisive tourists, weaving through the narrow aisle of a butcher shop, and sliding past a long line at a cheesesteak stand. Near the back of the market, Evelyn saw their chance, a side exit leading onto a smaller alley. They slipped out, emerging back into the relative quiet of the city. They walked quickly down the alley, took 2 sharp turns, and flattened themselves into the recessed doorway of an old warehouse, their hearts pounding. They waited, listening. After a full minute of silence, they risked a look. The street was empty. They had lost him. The relief was temporary. They couldn't go back to the motel. They needed a safe, anonymous place to analyze the clue they had risked so much to acquire. They found their temporary sanctuary in the quiet, hushed halls of the University of Pennsylvania's main library, a place where 2 people hunched over a tablet would be utterly invisible among thousands of students. In a secluded corral on an upper floor, Evelyn brought the raking light photograph up on her encrypted tablet. The deeper pressed letters from the book were now starkly clear, isolated from the rest of the text. They read, TASOHNMEHUO. It's an anagram, Evelyn said, already running the letters through a decryption algorithm on her device. The program spit out hundreds of possible combinations, most of them nonsensical. Ethan stared at the letters, his mind working from a different angle. Think like Franklin, he said. Think about his life, his work, his city. He wrote the letters down on a piece of paper, rearranging them. His eyes fell on the first 5 letters of his own arrangement, THOMAS. Thomas, he said. It has to be Thomas. Maybe a reference to Thomas Jefferson? Or Thomas Paine? Evelyn quickly filtered the anagram results for any phrase starting with Thomas. The screen refreshed, showing a single, perfect match. Her breath caught. The letters unscrambled to form 2 words, Thomas Hune House. They stared at the solution, a new mystery replacing the old one. Thomas Hune? Ethan said, frustration creeping into his voice. I've never heard of him. He's not a signer of the Declaration, not a member of the Continental Congress. I've never encountered that name in any major colonial-era text. A quick search on their burner phone confirmed it. There was no prominent historical figure named Thomas Hune. It was a dead end, a meaningless name. It can't be, Ethan insisted, his mind racing. Every other clue has been precise, logical. This has to mean something. He looked back at the name, saying it aloud. Thomas Hune. Thomas Hune House. He thought of Franklin's love of puzzles, of puns and wordplay. He remembered his grandfather's notes on Franklin's various ciphers. One of them wasn't about writing, but about sound. A phonetic cipher. It's not what it says, he whispered, a wild idea forming. It's what it sounds like. Evelyn, say it slowly. Thomas. Hune. She repeated, puzzled. Don't say Hune, Ethan urged. Say what it sounds like. Hewn. T-O-M-B hewn. A tomb, hewn from stone. A house that is a tomb, hewn from stone. It wasn't a name. It was a riddle. A description of a place. Ethan's fingers flew across the phone's keypad, searching not for a person, but for a place that fit the description. He typed in Benjamin Franklin, Stone Vault, Philadelphia. The search results were a jumble of historical sites. But one link stood out. It was an article about the American Philosophical Society, the learned society Franklin had founded in 1743. He clicked it. He read a line aloud, his voice trembling with the thrill of final discovery. The society's home, Philosophical Hall, was constructed adjacent to Independence Hall. In his private letters, Franklin often referred to the secure, fireproof vault he designed for the basement, where the society's most valuable books and instruments were kept, as his stone cabinet, his tomb for treasured knowledge. That was it. The final location. The keystone was not in a grand monument or a forgotten crypt. It was hidden in a vault designed by Franklin himself, in the basement of the American Philosophical Society, a building dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge. Ethan looked up, a triumphant smile on his face, ready to share the news with Evelyn. But his smile vanished. Through the large library window, he could see the street below, and standing calmly on the opposite corner, partially obscured by a tree, was the man in the gray suit. He was looking right up at them. They hadn't lost him at the market. He had let them go. He had followed them from a distance, patiently waiting, letting them do the final piece of work for him. He now knew what they knew. The race wasn't over. It had just arrived at the finish line, and their enemy was waiting for them there. There was no time for shock, no time for a whispered plan. The moment Ethan's eyes met the janitors across the street, the Cold War of secrets and surveillance was over. The race had begun. "Go," Ethan said, his voice a low, urgent command. He grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulling her away from the library window and towards the emergency exit. They burst out of the library and into the crisp afternoon air, not looking back, running on pure adrenaline. Their destination was 3 blocks away, a straight shot through the heart of Independence National Historical Park. They ran past bewildered tourists and startled pigeons, the historic brick buildings of colonial Philadelphia blurring in their periphery. They could hear the hurried footsteps of the janitor behind them, keeping pace, a relentless shadow in a gray suit. They reached the manicured lawns surrounding Philosophical Hall. The building was stately and unassuming, its old bricks seeming to soak up the afternoon sun. A small crowd of visitors was milling near the entrance. They couldn't just run inside and down to the basement, they'd be stopped in seconds. The janitor was closing the distance, now only 50 yards behind them. "The entrance," Evelyn said, her mind working at lightning speed. "The public can't get to the basement, but a security alert can." She veered away from the front door and towards a small modern utility box mounted discreetly on the side of the building. She opened a small pouch on her belt, extracting 2 thin pieces of metal. It wasn't a lockpick, but a bypass tool. She forced the panel open, revealing a complex web of wires. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, his eyes darting between her and their approaching pursuer. "Creating a diversion," she said, her fingers finding a specific pair of wires. "Not the fire alarm. Too big a response. This is the humidity and temperature sensor for the basement archives. I'm going to make it report a catastrophic failure. The guard's first priority will be to secure the sensitive documents." She crossed the wires. Nothing happened for a second, then a low, insistent alarm began to chime from inside the building. Through the front windows, they saw a security guard speak urgently into his radio before hurrying towards a door marked, "Staff Only." "Now," Evelyn commanded, pulling the panel shut. They walked, forcing a calm demeanor, through the front doors of the hall. The main lobby was in a state of controlled confusion. A second guard was directing visitors to stay clear of the hallway leading to the back of the building. In the midst of the commotion, no one noticed Ethan and Evelyn slip past the distracted guard and through the now unattended staff door. They found the stairs and descended into the cool, quiet basement. It smelled of old stone and archival dust. They were in a maze of shelves, but the blueprints Ethan had studied had been clear. The main vault was at the far end of the central corridor. They found it, a massive iron-bound door set into the stone foundation, exactly as the records had described. There was no modern keypad, only a large, circular brass plate in the center, surrounded by strange, carved symbols. There was no keyhole. This was the final lock. And they held the final key. "The disc," Ethan said, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled the heavy brass volvel from its padded case. It fit perfectly into the circular indentation on the door. He then opened the celestial atlas to the marked page, the star chart that mirrored the crest on the dollar bill. The pattern of faint, hidden stars was the combination. Working together, Evelyn calling out the sequence from the book, Ethan carefully turned the concentric rings of the disc now seated in the door. Each turn had to be precise. With every click, he could feel the ancient locking mechanism shifting deep within the iron door. After the final symbol was aligned, there was a deep, resonant thud from inside the vault. A heavy iron bar had been withdrawn. Ethan pushed, and the massive door swung inward with a low groan, revealing the darkness within. The tomb for treasured knowledge was a small, cube-shaped room, its walls, floor, and ceiling made of single, massive slabs of granite. It was empty, save for a simple stone pedestal in the exact center. And resting on the pedestal, looking small and inert in the gloom, was the keystone. It was a beautiful, intricate sphere of interlocking brass rings and gears, about the size of a bowling ball. At its core was a large, milky white crystal that seemed to drink the light from the hallway. It didn't hum or glow. It was simply an object of impossible craftsmanship, waiting silently as it had for over 2 centuries. Ethan stepped into the vault, his hand outstretched, the culmination of his grandfather's obsession and his own incredible journey now just inches away. He was about to touch it when a calm, quiet voice spoke from the doorway behind them. "I wouldn't do that, Professor." They spun around. The janitor stood in the vault's entrance, blocking their only exit. He wasn't armed, his hands held loosely at his sides. His face was impassive, his breathing even. The chase was over. For 240 years, the man said, his voice level and devoid of malice. That object has been a source of obsession, madness, and death for anyone who has come near it. It is a seed of discord planted in the heart of our history. My organization was founded by a man who saw the danger firsthand, a man who believes some knowledge is too dangerous to exist. Our sole purpose is not to possess it, but to end its story. He took a single, deliberate step into the vault. You have been a worthy opponent, Professor, more resourceful than any in generations. But you have brought it to the light, and now my work can be completed. Give it to me. Let it be over. Ethan looked from the man to the keystone resting on its pedestal. Evelyn stood beside him, her body tense, ready for a fight. The janitor stood before them, an ideologue, not a thug, his purpose absolute. They were trapped. The culmination of their quest was right in front of them, but the final choice was the one thing no map or cipher could have prepared them for: to surrender the greatest secret in American history, or to risk everything to protect a power they could not even begin to comprehend. The janitor's calm, reasonable voice was more disarming than any weapon could have been. He stood in the vault's doorway, a man not of violence, but of chilling, absolute conviction. Ethan and Evelyn were trapped, not just physically, but in a philosophical cage he had constructed with his words. "Destroy it," Ethan said, his voice a strained whisper. "How can you even consider destroying something like this? It's the most important historical artifact in existence. It could rewrite our understanding of science, of history, of everything." "You're making the same mistake they all do, Professor," the janitor replied, his gaze unwavering. "You see the potential for knowledge. I see the price of it. I've read the histories. I know about the scholars who went mad, the rivalries that turned deadly, the obsession that consumed your own grandfather. That object is a siren song, luring the brilliant and the curious to their ruin. Its existence has protected no one and has destroyed many. The most compassionate act we can perform is to grant it the peace of oblivion." He was presenting them with a choice, a dark and tempting absolution. They could hand over the keystone, and their part in the story would be over. They could walk away, back to their normal lives, and leave the burden of this impossible secret to him. Ethan looked at the keystone, resting silently on its stone pedestal. He thought of his grandfather, a man he had dismissed as a paranoid lunatic, who had in fact been a guardian, a link in a chain of untold sacrifice. He thought of the sheer, breathtaking genius of the puzzle that had led them here. It was not a creation of chaos and madness. It was a creation of profound, meticulous order. His grandfather hadn't sought to possess it for power, but to understand it. And in that moment, Ethan knew he could not let its story end here, in the dark, at the hands of a man who feared it. In a move that was part defiance, part desperation, and part uncontrollable curiosity, Ethan reached out and placed his hand on the cool, metallic surface of the keystone. The reaction was instantaneous, but not violent. There was no explosion, no bolt of energy. Instead, a soft, resonant hum filled the small vault, a sound that seemed to vibrate not in the air, but in the bones. The interlocking rings of the device began to move, rotating in slow, complex, and utterly silent patterns. The milky white crystal at the sphere's core pulsed with a soft, internal light, and then turned perfectly, impossibly clear. From the crystal, a beam of light, no thicker than a pencil, shot out and hit the stone wall of the vault. But it didn't illuminate the stone. It seemed to pass through it. On the wall, a shimmering, translucent window, about 3 feet wide, appeared. It wasn't a projection, it was a view. Through the window, they saw not the stone foundation of the hall, but a swirling, chaotic sea of geometric patterns and what looked like threads of pure light, a brief, breathtaking glimpse into the fundamental architecture of the universe. It was not a weapon. It was an observatory, a tool for seeing the unseen. The janitor stared, his calm demeanor shattered for the first time. His face was a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. His life's work, his organization's entire philosophy, was built on the premise that this object was a corrupting force, a source of chaos. But the reality of it, the sheer, elegant, scientific beauty of it, was something his doctrine had never prepared him for. He was a man of faith whose God had just been proven false. In that single, priceless moment of his hesitation, Evelyn acted. She didn't reach for a weapon. She reached into her bag and pulled out the powerful, handheld electromagnet she had used on the lab's computers. "Ethan, get ready to run," she hissed. She thumbed the activation switch. The magnet let out a sharp, electrical crackle. The effect was immediate. The shimmering window projected by the keystone flared violently, collapsing in on itself. The device itself let out a high-pitched, disorienting shriek as the powerful magnetic field washed over it. The lights in the basement flickered and died, plunging them into near total darkness, the only illumination coming from the keystone's now erratic internal glow. The pulse also fried the janitor's radio earpiece, which sparked and went silent. Disoriented by the light and the sound, the janitor staggered back a step, momentarily blinded. It was the only opening they would get. Ethan lunged forward, grabbing the keystone from its pedestal. It was warm now, and it thrummed with a strange living energy in his hands. "Now!" Evelyn yelled. They charged out of the vault, pushing past the stunned janitor. They ran through the dark basement, the sound of newly triggered security alarms beginning to blare through the building. They burst out of the staff door and back into the main lobby, a scene of utter chaos as guards tried to manage the confused visitors. They didn't stop. They ran out the front doors and back into the fading afternoon light of Philadelphia, melting into the anonymous flow of the city. They didn't look back. They were no longer hunters. They were no longer solving a puzzle. They had found the prize. And in doing so, they had become the new custodians, the sole protectors of the most profound and dangerous secret in American history, with the weight of an impossible machine now literally and figuratively in their hands. 2 weeks after the chaotic flight from Philadelphia, the world was a different place. Or rather, Ethan and Evelyn were in a different part of it, a part so removed from their previous lives that it felt like another world entirely. They were in a small, rustic cabin nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, a place found through one of Evelyn's old university contacts who valued privacy above all else. There was no cell service, a single satellite dish for a heavily encrypted internet connection, and a long, winding dirt road as the only path to the outside world. Here, in the quiet solitude of the ancient mountains, the keystone sat not on a pedestal of stone, but on a sturdy oak table in the center of the main room. It was no longer an object to be hunted, but one to be studied. The frantic hunted energy that had propelled them across the country had been replaced by a quiet, profound sense of awe and immense responsibility. They were no longer runners, they were guardians. Their days fell into a new rhythm. Evelyn, the scientist, worked to understand the keystone's physical nature. She analyzed the strange, non-reactive alloy of its rings. She theorized about the nature of the central crystal, which seemed to be a perfect, flawless lattice of an element that did not appear on the periodic table. She worked to map the energy signature it gave off when active, a form of radiation that she could detect but not identify. She treated it with the cautious, meticulous respect one would give an unexploded bomb or a holy relic. Ethan, the historian, worked to understand its context. He spent his days with the celestial atlas, the brass disc, and his grandfather's journal spread before him. He was no longer just solving a puzzle, but piecing together the secret history of the custodians. He saw them now not as a shadowy cabal, but as a small, desperate fraternity of brilliant minds, Franklin, Jefferson, and others, who had stumbled upon something magnificent and terrifying. They hadn't hidden it out of a desire for power, he realized, but out of a deep-seated fear of what the world would do with it. One evening, as a cool mountain breeze rustled the trees outside, Ethan sat on the cabin's porch, reading his grandfather's journal. He came across the final entry, written in a shaky, frail hand he had never seen before. "I will not see the end of this road," Arthur had written. "And perhaps that is for the best. My obsession has cost me much, but I do not regret the chase. To know that such a thing is possible, that the universe is so much grander and more mysterious than we are led to believe, is a gift. I hope you find it, Ethan. Not for my sake, or for history's, but for your own. I hope you get to stand at the edge of the great mystery and see. Just see." Tears welled in Ethan's eyes. He finally understood his grandfather, not as the paranoid madman of his memory, but as a lonely sentinel who had spent his life protecting a secret he could never share. The journey had not just led Ethan to the keystone, it had led him back to the grandfather he had never truly known. Evelyn came out and sat beside him, a cup of tea in her hands. The silence between them was comfortable, the bond forged in tunnels and archives now something deep and unspoken. "What do we do with it, Ethan?" she asked quietly, looking out at the darkening forest. "The janitors will be looking for us. They won't stop. Do we just hide it forever, like the custodians did?" "Hiding it feels like a failure," Ethan said, closing the journal. "Destroying it, like the janitors want, is a crime. And revealing it, can you imagine the chaos? The wars that would be fought over it. The panic it would cause." They had been circling this question for days, the central ethical dilemma at the heart of their discovery. They were the inheritors of the choice Franklin and his circle had faced centuries ago. "The custodians hid it because they were afraid," Evelyn said, thinking aloud. "The janitors want to destroy it because they are afraid. Maybe the answer is to not be afraid." She looked at Ethan, her eyes clear with a new sense of purpose. "We don't hide it, and we don't reveal it. We do what they couldn't. We understand it. We create a new order, a new set of custodians. Not just to guard it, but to learn from it. to study it safely, and to spend our lives preparing a path for a day when humanity might, just might, be ready for the truth. It was the third option, the one that honored the past but embraced the future. It was not an end to the story, but the beginning of a much longer, more important one. Their purpose was clear. Later that night, they stood before the keystone inside the cabin. The world outside was a tapestry of starlight and shadow. With a gentle touch, Ethan activated the device. The familiar, bone-deep hum filled the room, and the crystal cleared. The shimmering window opened before them, a portal to the fundamental, beautiful, and terrifying mechanics of reality itself. They were no longer running. They were no longer being chased. They were Dr. Ethan Hayes and Dr. Evelyn Reed, fugitives, guardians, and the sole proprietors of the greatest observatory in human history. The treasure hunt was over. The age of discovery had just begun.